Some wounds never heal, they just learn to live quietly in the shadows of our hearts. For Samuel Reed, grief became his only companion after burying the woman he loved more than life itself. For 7 years, he's lived alone in his Wyoming mountain cabin, speaking to no one and trusting even less. The harsh winter of 1880 suits him fine, the cold matches what's left of his soul. But tonight, everything changes when a desperate knock breaks his silence. A young woman named Beth stands at his door, barefoot in the snow, her eyes filled with terror. "Can I stay just tonight?" she whispers. Samuel knows he should turn her away. He's forgotten how to care for anyone. But something in her voice reminds him of what it felt like to be human. Will this broken mountain man find the strength to help her? Or will his fear of losing someone again keep his door and his heart forever closed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled across the Wyoming territory like a living thing, carrying with it the promise of another brutal night. Samuel Reed stood frozen in his doorway, the warmth of his cabin bleeding out into the February darkness as he stared at the trembling figure before him. Snow swirled between them, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, neither moved. The woman, barely more than a girl, really clutched her thin shawl against the wind. Her feet were bare, he noticed with alarm, already turning blue against the white ground. Dark hair whipped across a face pale with cold, and something deeper fear that had carved itself into the very bones of her. "Please," she whispered again, her voice nearly lost in the storm. "I won't cause trouble. I just need—" Samuel's weathered hand tightened on the doorframe. 7 years. 7 years since another human being had stood on his threshold. 7 years since he'd heard a voice other than his own echo off these log walls. The wedding ring on his left hand seemed to burn against his skin, a circle of gold that had become his anchor to a past that would never return. Margaret. Even now, with this stranger shivering before him, his wife's memory rose unbidden. Margaret, with her gentle smile and capable hands, the way she'd hum while kneading bread, how she'd brush her auburn hair by lamplight. Margaret, who died in these very mountains when the fever took her, leaving Samuel with nothing but graves to tend and memories that cut deeper than any Wyoming winter. "Sir?" The young woman's voice brought him back to the present. She swayed slightly, exhaustion and cold taking their toll. Samuel looked past her into the swirling darkness, searching for signs of pursuit. "You alone?" She nodded quickly. "Yes. I ran. I've been walking since dawn." Since dawn, in this weather, on bare feet. Samuel's jaw tightened as he calculated the distance from the nearest settlement. 15 miles, maybe 20, depending on which direction she'd come from. No one should have survived such a journey, yet here she stood. "Who's after you?" His voice came out rougher than intended, rusty from disuse. The question made her flinch, and Samuel saw her glance nervously over her shoulder. "A man named Jeremiah Blackwood. Her voice broke. "My father owed him money. Made an arrangement." Samuel knew the name. Blackwood owned considerable land south of here, had a reputation for being hard on both his workers and his wives. 2 previous wives, if memory served, both dead before their time. The arrangement she spoke of could only mean one thing: marriage debt, Samuel said, not making it a question. She nodded miserably. "I was supposed to marry him tomorrow. When I saw him looking at me, the way he smiled." She shuddered. I couldn't do it." Something shifted in Samuel's chest, a feeling he'd thought, buried with Margaret. "This girl, Beth, she'd called herself reminded him of a young deer he'd once found caught in a trap. The same wide eyes, the same desperate need for sanctuary. Margaret's apron still hung on the wooden peg beside the door, untouched for 7 years. In the early days after her death, Samuel had convinced himself he was preserving something sacred. Now, looking at this shivering stranger, he wondered if he'd simply been afraid to live. "How old are you?" he asked. 28, she replied, then added quickly, "I know I look younger. People always say, you don't need to explain yourself." Samuel stepped back, decision made before his conscious mind caught up. "Come in." The relief that washed over her face was immediate and overwhelming. She stumbled forward, and Samuel caught her elbow to steady her. Her skin was ice-cold through the thin fabric of her dress. "Thank you," she breathed. "I promise I'll leave as soon as—" "Sit," Samuel commanded, guiding her to the chair beside his fireplace. The cabin felt suddenly smaller with another person in it. He'd grown accustomed to moving through the space like a ghost, everything positioned exactly where he expected it. Now he found himself acutely aware of every detail. The unwashed dishes in his wash basin, the newspapers stacked beside his bed, the spare room that had once been intended for children who never came. Beth sank into the chair with a soft sigh, holding her hands toward the fire. Samuel knelt and examined her feet with the practiced eye of a man who doctored both animals and humans. Frostbite was setting in, but not beyond treatment. "I'll need to warm these slowly," he said, already moving toward the kitchen area. "Too fast, and you'll lose feeling permanent-like." As he prepared a basin of lukewarm water, Samuel found himself stealing glances at his unexpected guest. In the firelight, she looked less like the desperate creature who'd appeared at his door, and more like what she probably was under normal circumstances, a capable young woman with intelligent eyes and steady hands despite her trembling. "You live here alone?" she asked softly. 7 years now." Samuel set the basin beside her chair. "My wife died of fever, winter of 73. I'm sorry." The words were simple but genuine. "That must have been terrible." Samuel had grown skilled at deflecting sympathy over the years, but something in Beth's tone made him pause. She spoke like someone who understood loss, not just someone offering polite condolences. "You lost someone too," he observed. Beth nodded, carefully lowering her feet into the warm water. "My sister and my parents, though that was longer ago. Annie died just last year. Fever, like your wife." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling fire and the wind outside. Samuel found himself studying Beth's profile in the flickering light. She had an interesting face, not conventionally beautiful perhaps, but striking. There was intelligence there, and something else. Strength maybe, though it was buried under layers of exhaustion and fear. "What's your trade?" Samuel asked eventually. "I worked as a seamstress in town, took in washing too. After Annie died, I was managing well enough on my own, but then father's debts came due." Her hands clenched in her lap. "Mr. Blackwood said he'd forgive everything if I married him." Made it sound like kindness, but it wasn't. No. Her voice was barely audible. He made it clear what kind of wife he expected. Quiet, obedient, available. She shuddered again. "When he looked at me, I felt like livestock being appraised." Samuel's jaw tightened. He'd seen Blackwood's previous wives in town over the years, women who'd started out bright and gradually faded into hollow-eyed shadows of themselves. Both had died young, officially from illness, but under circumstances that raised questions no one seemed willing to ask. "You were right to run," he said simply. Beth looked up at him with surprise, as if she'd expected judgment rather than support. "Most folks think a woman should be grateful for any husband willing to take her. Most folks haven't seen what I've seen." Samuel stood and moved to his small kitchen area. "You hungry?" "I don't want to impose. When's the last time you ate?" Beth considered this. "Yesterday morning, I think. Maybe the morning before. Time gets mixed up when you're walking." Samuel pulled dried venison and hardtack from his stores, along with preserved vegetables from the root cellar beneath the cabin floor. As he worked, he found himself remembering the rhythm of cooking for two. The way Margaret had always insisted on proper meals, even when money was tight. "Tell me about this place," Beth said, her voice stronger now that warmth was returning to her body. "Built it myself, mostly. Started in 71, year after Margaret and I married. We were going to run cattle, maybe some sheep." Samuel's hands moved automatically as he prepared their simple meal. Had plans for expanding the cabin, adding a proper barn, maybe even a small orchard in the sheltered valley below. What happened to those plans? Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Hard to build a future by yourself. After Margaret died, seemed easier to just maintain what was already here. Beth nodded thoughtfully. "I understand that feeling. After Annie died, I couldn't bring myself to change anything in our little room above the dress shop. Kept her clothes in the trunk, her books on the shelf. Like maybe if I left everything the same, she might come back." "Did it help?" "No." Beth's smile was sad but honest. "Just made the room feel like a museum instead of a home." They shared the meal in companionable quiet, Beth eating with the careful restraint of someone who'd gone too long without food but didn't want to appear desperate. Samuel found himself watching her hands as she broke apart the hardtack, neat, efficient movements that spoke of years of careful work. "The dress you're wearing," he said eventually. "It's torn." Beth looked down at the hem of her brown wool dress, where the fabric had caught and ripped during her flight. "I grabbed what I could. Didn't have time to pack properly. Margaret was about your size. Her clothes are still." Samuel stopped, the words catching in his throat. For 7 years, her dresses had hung untouched in the wardrobe, another shrine to his inability to move forward. "I couldn't take her things," Beth said gently. "That wouldn't be right." But Samuel was already moving toward the bedroom, driven by an impulse he didn't fully understand. Margaret's clothes hung exactly where she'd left them, still carrying the faint scent of the lavender sachets she'd made. His fingers touched a simple blue wool dress, one she'd worn for everyday work around their small ranch. Margaret had been generous with everything she owned. She'd given clothes to neighbors in need, shared food with struggling families, opened their home to anyone who needed shelter. Keeping her belongings locked away wasn't honoring her memory, it was denying everything she'd stood for. Samuel returned to the main room carrying the blue dress. "She would have wanted you to have this," he said, offering it to Beth. "Margaret never could stand to see someone in need." Beth accepted the dress with careful reverence, running her fingers over the soft wool. "She sounds like she was a good woman." "She was." Samuel's voice was rough with emotion. "Better than I deserved, probably. I doubt that's true. You don't know me well enough to judge." Beth looked up at him with those intelligent eyes. "I know you opened your door to a stranger in a storm. I know you're feeding me and offering me clothes and haven't asked for anything in return. That tells me plenty about who you are." Samuel turned away, uncomfortable with the assessment. He'd spent 7 years thinking of himself as a broken man, someone who'd failed at the most important things in life. Having this stranger see something worthy in him felt dangerous, like hope he couldn't afford. "Storm's getting worse," he observed, listening to the wind batter the cabin walls. "You'll need to stay until it passes." "How long do these storms usually last?" Samuel shrugged. "Could be a day, could be a week. February weather's unpredictable up here." Beth nodded, apparently unsurprised by this prospect. I'm grateful for whatever shelter you can provide. I know this must be strange for you, having someone disrupt your routine. Strange didn't begin to cover it. For 7 years, Samuel's days had followed the same pattern. Rise before dawn, tend the fire, check his traps, maintain his equipment, read by lamplight until sleep took him. Now, with Beth curled in his chair by the fire, everything felt different. The cabin seemed brighter, warmer, more alive than it had since Margaret's death. It terrified him. "I'll take the floor," Samuel said gruffly. "You can have the bed. I can't take your bed." "It's decided." His tone brooked no argument. "I've slept in worse places." As they prepared for sleep, Samuel found himself hyper-aware of every sound. Beth made the soft rustle of fabric as she changed into Margaret's dress, her quiet footsteps across the wooden floor, the gentle sigh as she settled onto the bed that had been empty for so long. He lay on his bedroll by the fire, staring up at the log ceiling and listening to the storm rage outside. For the first time in 7 years, he wasn't alone with his memories. The presence of another human being in his sanctuary should have felt like an intrusion, but instead it felt like something else entirely. It felt like the first breath after drowning. Samuel closed his eyes and tried not to think about what would happen when the storm passed, and Beth continued on her journey. He'd grown skilled at not thinking about the future, at living one day at a time in his mountain fortress. But tonight, with a stranger's quiet breathing filling the darkness, the future seemed to press against him like the weight of snow on his cabin roof. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions he wasn't prepared to make. But for now, for this one night, Samuel Reed was no longer the loneliest man in Wyoming territory, and despite every instinct that told him to guard his heart, he found that thought less terrifying than it should have been. Dawn crept slowly across the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. Samuel woke to unfamiliar sounds, the soft breathing of another person, the gentle rustle of fabric, as Beth stirred in the bed that had been silent for 7 years. For a moment he lay still on his bedroll, disoriented by the change in his carefully ordered world. The storm had blown itself out sometime during the night, leaving behind a crystalline silence that seemed to amplify every small noise in the cabin. Samuel rose quietly and moved to build up the fire, his movements automatic after years of solitary routine. As he worked, he became aware of Beth watching him from the bed. "Good morning," she said softly, her voice still rough with sleep. "Morning." Samuel's response was gruff, but not unkind. "How are your feet?" Beth flexed her toes experimentally beneath the heavy quilts. "Much better. The feelings come back completely." Samuel nodded, relieved. He'd seen men lose toes to frostbite, and the thought of this young woman suffering permanent damage on his watch had troubled his sleep. "Storms passed. You'll be able to travel today if you want." Something flickered across Beth's face, an emotion too complex to name. Relief? Disappointment? Fear? She sat up slowly, Margaret's blue dress wrinkled from sleep, but clean and warm. "Where will you go?" Samuel asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Beth was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "I hadn't thought past getting away from Blackwood. I suppose I could try to find work in Denver, or maybe head west to California." "Denver's a hard city for a woman alone. California's worse. I'm stronger than I look." Samuel didn't doubt that, but strength alone wouldn't protect her from the kind of men who preyed on unaccompanied women in mining towns and railroad cities. The thought of Beth facing such dangers stirred something protective in him, a feeling he'd thought died with Margaret. "There's something you should know," Beth said suddenly, her voice taking on a different quality, "about why I really ran." Samuel paused in his fire tending. "You said Blackwood wanted to marry you for your father's debt." "That's true, but it's not the whole truth." Beth's hands twisted in the quilt. "The debt wasn't just money. My father, he was a gambling man, lost everything we had and more. When he died, Blackwood came to collect, but there was nothing left except—" She swallowed hard. "Except me." Samuel's jaw tightened. "A marriage contract, signed and witnessed, legal in territorial court." Beth's voice was barely above a whisper. "I tried to fight it, went to the sheriff, even spoke to the circuit judge when he came through town. They all said the same thing: a debt is a debt, and a father has the right to arrange his daughter's marriage." The implications hit Samuel like a physical blow. Beth wasn't just a runaway bride. She was technically fleeing a legal obligation. If Blackwood wanted to pursue the matter, he could have her arrested and brought back by force. "Show me," Samuel said. Beth looked confused. "Show you what?" "The contract. You must have seen it." With obvious reluctance, Beth reached into the small bundle of belongings she'd carried with her. From between the folds of her torn dress, she produced a folded paper, yellowed with age and handling. Samuel took it and moved closer to the window to read by the morning light. The document was everything he'd feared, and worse. Not only did it legally bind Beth to marry Jeremiah Blackwood, but it included clauses about her conduct, her duties, and even her right to leave the marriage. It read more like a bill of sale than a wedding contract. "My father was drunk when he signed it," Beth said quietly. "Blackwood had been buying him drinks all evening, lending him money for more gambling. By the time they drew up this agreement, Papa would have signed anything." Samuel folded the paper carefully, his mind racing. "This isn't just a marriage contract. It's indentured servitude. The judge said it was legal. Legal and right aren't always the same thing." Samuel moved to his desk and pulled out a leather-bound Bible, its pages worn from years of handling. It had been Margaret's, filled with pressed flowers and careful notes in her delicate handwriting. "You said you tried to fight this in court. What exactly did you tell them?" "That I didn't consent to the marriage, that I was barely 18 when my father signed the contract, and I'd had no say in the matter." Beth's voice grew bitter. "The judge said a woman's consent wasn't required if her father had given permission legally." Samuel opened the Bible. Not to read scripture, but to study the pressed flowers Margaret had preserved between its pages. She'd been a woman of deep faith, but also practical wisdom. She'd often said that God's law and man's law didn't always align, and when they conflicted, a person had to choose which master they would serve. "I've been thinking about this all night," Beth continued. "Even if I get away, even if I make it to California or back east somewhere, Blackwood could still come after me. This contract gives him legal rights to me as his property. You're not property. Tell that to the territorial courts." Samuel closed the Bible with a soft thud. There might be another way." "What do you mean?" Samuel hesitated, knowing that what he was about to propose would change everything for both of them. "The contract is between your father and Blackwood, but your father is dead. His debts survived him. That's why I'm bound by this agreement." "Not necessarily." Samuel moved to his desk and pulled out a collection of legal papers, documents related to his own land ownership and marriage. "When Margaret and I married, we had to research territorial marriage law because she'd been previously married to a man who died. There are provisions for contracts that become void under certain circumstances." Beth leaned forward, hope flickering in her eyes. "What kind of circumstances?" If the woman in question is already married to someone else, the original contract becomes unenforceable. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire. Beth stared at Samuel, understanding dawning slowly across her face. "You're suggesting I marry someone else, just to escape Blackwood? I'm suggesting it might be your only legal option." "But who would?" Beth stopped, her eyes widening as she realized what Samuel was proposing. "You? You're talking about marrying me?" Samuel felt heat rise in his face. Put so bluntly, the idea sounded insane. A man who'd lived as a hermit for 7 years, proposing marriage to a woman he'd known for less than 24 hours. "It would be a practical arrangement," he said quickly, "to protect you from Blackwood. Nothing more. A marriage in name only. Yes." Beth was quiet for a long time, studying Samuel's face as if trying to read his true intentions. "Why would you do that for me? You don't even know me." It was a fair question, and Samuel wasn't sure he had a good answer. Why would he risk his carefully constructed solitude to help a stranger? Why did the thought of Beth facing Blackwood's cruelty make his chest tight with anger? "Maybe because someone should have. It helped Margaret when she needed it," he said finally. "Before I knew her, she was married to a man who treated her badly. No one stood up for her then. Maybe it's time someone stood up for you. This would change your whole life. You've been alone here for 7 years. You've built this place to be your sanctuary. And you need sanctuary more than I need solitude." Beth stood and moved to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. "If we did this, if we married, what would you expect from me? Nothing you're not willing to give. You could stay here, help with the work if you wanted, or you could leave once you felt safe. The marriage would give you legal protection, but it wouldn't make you my property the way Blackwood's contract would. And you? What would you get out of this arrangement?" Samuel considered the question. What would he get? Company, certainly. Someone to share the work of maintaining the homestead. But there was something else, something he was afraid to name. For the first time in 7 years, he felt useful again. Needed. The prospect of helping Beth escape her situation had awakened something in him that he'd thought permanently buried. "Maybe a chance to be something other than a lonely old hermit," he said honestly. Beth turned from the window to face him. "You're not old. You can't be much past 50, 52, old enough to know what loneliness does to a man. And young enough to start over, if you wanted to." They looked at each other across the small cabin, both aware that they stood at a crossroads that would determine the course of their lives. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, melting snow from the cabin's roof in a steady drip that marked the passage of time. "If I agreed to this," Beth said slowly, "when would we, how would we? The circuit preacher comes through every few months, should be back this way in a week or 2. Or we could ride down to Cheyenne if you wanted it done legal and formal. Blackwood will come looking for me. Let him come." Samuel's voice carried a hardness that surprised them both. "This is my land, and I defend what's mine. You'd fight him? Risk your life for someone you barely know?" Samuel moved to the mantelpiece and picked up a small daguerreotype in a silver frame. Margaret, on their wedding day, young and beautiful and full of hope for their future together. He studied her face for a moment, then set the photograph down with careful deliberation. 7 years ago, I thought my life was over. Thought I'd never care about anything or anyone again. Maybe I was wrong." Beth's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "This is more kindness than I have any right to expect. Everyone has a right to choose their own life, even if that choice puts you in danger." Samuel met her gaze steadily. "Especially then." Beth wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and nodded slowly. "Then yes, if you're truly willing, I accept your proposal." The words settled between them with the weight of destiny. In the space of a single conversation, two lonely people had decided to bind their lives together, not for love, but for something equally powerful, the chance at freedom and the possibility of redemption. Samuel felt something shift in his chest, like ice cracking on a frozen river. For 7 years, he'd existed in a state of suspended animation, neither fully alive nor completely dead. Now, with Beth's acceptance, he felt the first stirrings of something that might eventually become hope. "Then it's settled," he said simply. "We'll be married." Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the promise of more storms to come. But inside the cabin, warmth and light pushed back against the cold, and two damaged souls began the careful work of learning to trust again. The first full day of their engagement unfolded with a careful awkwardness that neither Samuel nor Beth had anticipated. The morning's momentous decision seemed to hang in the air between them like morning mist, present but intangible, coloring every interaction with new weight and meaning. Samuel stood at his kitchen counter, slicing salt pork for breakfast, acutely aware of Beth moving quietly around the cabin behind him. She'd made the bed with military precision, folded her few belongings into neat piles, and now seemed to be studying the space as if seeing it for the first time, which, in a way, she was. Yesterday she'd been a desperate stranger seeking shelter. Today she was his intended wife, and the transformation required a complete recalibration of how they related to each other and the space they now shared. "I don't want to disrupt your routine," Beth said softly, settling into the chair by the fire. "I know you've built a life here that works for you." Samuel paused in his slicing, his routine. For 7 years, his days had followed the same predictable pattern. Wake before dawn, check the fire, prepare a simple breakfast, tend to his few animals, check his traps, maintain his equipment, read by lamplight until exhaustion claimed him. It was a life designed for survival, not happiness, a careful construction meant to fill time without requiring too much thought or feeling. "Routines can change," he said, though the words felt foreign in his mouth, "but they don't have to change completely." Beth's voice carried a note of careful diplomacy. "I could learn your ways, help with the work without getting in the way." Samuel turned to face her, the hunting rifle mounted above the fireplace, catching his eye. The weapon had been his constant companion for 7 years, a tool of protection and provision that represented his complete self-reliance. Now, looking at Beth sitting beneath it, he wondered if protection might mean something different than it had when he lived alone. "What kind of work did you do before?" he asked. "Besides sewing, everything," Beth replied with a small smile. "When you're supporting yourself and a sick sister, you learn quickly. I took in washing, mended clothes, cleaned houses, helped with harvests, even assisted the doctor when he needed an extra pair of hands. You know medicine? Some. Enough to treat cuts and fevers, set simple bones, assist with births." Beth's hands moved as she spoke, demonstrating the motions of wrapping bandages or checking pulse points. "My mother taught me before she died, said it was important for women to know how to care for people." Samuel found himself reassessing his future wife yet again. He'd thought he was offering protection to a helpless woman, but Beth's quiet competence suggested their arrangement might be more balanced than he'd realized. "The work here is different," he said. "Harder, maybe. Chopping wood, hauling water, preserving meat, preparing for winter. Everything has to be done by hand. I'm not afraid of hard work." It's not about fear. It's about... Samuel struggled to find the words. When Margaret was alive, we shared everything. Every task, every decision, every burden. After she died, I learned to do it all myself because I had to. Having someone else here again, dividing the work, it changes things. Beth nodded thoughtfully. You're worried about becoming dependent on help again. Something like that. What if we started small? Let me help with the things that would make your life easier, not the things that keep you alive. It was a wise distinction, and Samuel appreciated her understanding of the subtle difference. Survival skills were too important to risk sharing with someone who might leave. Comfort, however, was something he'd forgotten he needed. The washing, he said finally. I've been doing it poorly for 7 years. Beth's smile was genuinely amused. I noticed. Your clothes could use some attention. As if to demonstrate her point, she moved to where his spare shirt hung on a peg near the door. The garment was clean but rough, wrinkled from poor handling and stiff from soap that hadn't been properly rinsed out. You've been washing everything in cold water, she observed. Hot water's a luxury up here. Takes time and fuel to heat. Not a luxury, an investment. Hot water cleans better, rinses cleaner, lasts longer. Beth examined the shirt's fabric with the practiced eye of someone who'd made her living caring for clothes. This wool could be soft again with proper treatment. Samuel watched her hands as she worked, noting the careful way she examined the weave, testing for weak spots and signs of wear. Her touch was gentle but thorough, and he found himself remembering Margaret's similar attention to the details of domestic life. I could start there, Beth continued. Take over the washing and mending. It's work I know well, and it would free you for other tasks. What other tasks? Beth gestured toward the window, where morning light revealed the full scope of Samuel's mountain homestead. That shed looks like it could use repair. The fence around the vegetable garden has gaps, and unless I'm mistaken, you've got a root cellar that could be expanded. Samuel followed her gaze, seeing his property through fresh eyes. He'd maintained everything adequately for one person's survival, but he hadn't improved or expanded anything in years. The shed roof did leak in heavy rains. The garden fence was constantly being breached by rabbits and deer. The root cellar, carved into the hillside behind the cabin, was barely large enough to store winter provisions for one person, let alone 2. You've been planning, he said, not sure whether to be impressed or concerned. I've been thinking about how to be useful. If we're going to be married, I want to contribute something meaningful to our life together. Our life together. The phrase sent an unexpected warmth through Samuel's chest. For 7 years, everything had been my and mine, my cabin, my routine, my solitude. The prospect of ours felt simultaneously terrifying and appealing. There's something else, Beth said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. About Blackwood. Samuel's attention sharpened. What about him? He won't give up easily. The man I knew, the man who looked at me like property he was entitled to, he won't accept losing what he considers his investment. Let me worry about Blackwood. This is my fight too. I know him better than you do. I know how he thinks, how he operates. Beth's hands clenched in her lap. He'll come here eventually, and when he does, he'll come prepared. Probably bring men with him, maybe even legal documents to support his claim. Samuel had been thinking along similar lines, but hearing Beth voice the concerns made them feel more immediate and dangerous. What do you suggest? We need to be married as soon as possible. And we need witnesses, people who can testify that our marriage was legitimate and willing on both sides. The nearest neighbors are 20 miles away. Then we ride to them. Introduce ourselves, make connections. If Blackwood comes looking for me, we want people who can vouch for our marriage and your character." It was sound strategy, but it would require Samuel to do something he hadn't done in 7 years: interact with other people, allow them into his carefully guarded world. The thought of making small talk with neighbors, of explaining his hermit years and sudden marriage, made his stomach clench with anxiety. "I'm not good with people anymore," he admitted. "You're doing fine with me. That's different. You needed help. I know how to help." Beth studied his face with those intelligent eyes. "Maybe helping is how you connect with people. Maybe that's your way." Samuel turned back to preparing breakfast, but his mind was spinning with new possibilities and concerns. In the space of a day, his simple existence had become complicated, beyond anything he'd experienced since Margaret's death. He was committed now to protecting Beth, to marrying her, to building some kind of life together. The weight of that responsibility was both terrifying and oddly comforting. As he worked, he became aware of Beth moving quietly around the cabin, not rearranging anything but simply familiarizing herself with how he'd organized his life. She touched things gently, the stack of books beside his bed, the tools hanging on their pegs, the simple dishes in his wash basin, as if learning to read the story of his solitary years. "You're a careful man," she observed. "Everything has its place. When you live alone, order becomes important. Can't afford to lose things or waste time looking for them." "I understand that. After Annie died, I became very particular about how I arranged our room. Control over small things when you can't control the big things." Samuel nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. His obsessive organization had been less about efficiency and more about creating the illusion of control in a world that had proven devastatingly unpredictable. "That might need to change some," he said, "if we're sharing the space. Not change, expand. We'll find a way to organize things that works for both of us." The simple confidence in her voice surprised him. Beth spoke as if their success was a foregone conclusion, as if two damaged people could indeed build something functional and meaningful together. Samuel wanted to believe her, but 7 years of solitude had made him cautious about hope. Still, as morning turned toward midday and they worked together to prepare a simple meal, Samuel found himself noticing how naturally Beth moved through his space, how easily she anticipated his needs, how her presence seemed to bring a warmth to the cabin that had nothing to do with the fire. Perhaps, he thought, some changes were worth the risk. 3 days into their engagement, Samuel woke to the sound of Beth humming softly as she worked by the fire. The melody was unfamiliar but comforting, a gentle counterpoint to the familiar crackle of burning wood. For a moment, he lay still on his bedroll, listening to the first music his cabin had heard in 7 years. The storm that had brought Beth to his door had been followed by 2 more days of intermittent snow, providing a natural excuse for them both to remain sequestered in the mountain sanctuary. Samuel told himself he was simply being practical. The trails were dangerous, and Beth needed time to recover from her ordeal. But truthfully, he wasn't ready to face the outside world and the complications it would bring to their fragile arrangement. "Good morning," Beth said without turning from her work at the stove. She'd risen early and was already preparing breakfast, her movements efficient and quiet. "You don't have to cook for me," Samuel said, sitting up and running a hand through his graying hair. "I want to." Beth glanced over her shoulder with a small smile. "Besides, I'm a better cook than you are." It was true, though Samuel would never have admitted it aloud. In just 3 days, Beth had transformed his simple meals into something approaching actual cuisine. She'd found forgotten spices in his stores, combined ingredients in ways he'd never considered, and somehow made even salt, pork, and hardtack taste like a feast. Samuel rose and moved to the window, checking the sky out of habit, clear and cold, with the pale blue clarity that promised a beautiful winter day. The kind of day perfect for riding down to visit the Hendersons, his nearest neighbors, or making the longer journey to town for supplies and gossip. The kind of day he'd been avoiding for 3 days running. The weather's clearing, Beth observed, following his gaze. Might be a good day to make those visits we discussed. Samuel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Roads might still be difficult, or they might be fine. Beth's tone was gentle, but persistent. Samuel, we can't hide up here forever. If we're going to make this work, if we're going to protect what we're building, people need to know about us. She was right, of course. Samuel had been telling himself he was being cautious, but the truth was simpler and more shameful. He was afraid. Afraid of explaining his 7 years of isolation, afraid of subjecting Beth to curious stares and whispered speculation, afraid of opening their private world to outside judgment. What will we tell them? He asked. The truth, that we met, we fell in love, and we're getting married. Beth paused in her cooking to look at him directly. Or as much of the truth as they need to know. Samuel appreciated her diplomatic phrasing. Their neighbors didn't need to know about marriage contracts and forced arrangements. They didn't need to know that Samuel and Beth had known each other for less than a week. What mattered was establishing their relationship as legitimate and willing. The Hendersons will ask questions, Samuel warned. Mary Henderson is the biggest gossip in 3 counties. Good. Let her gossip about our romance, instead of wondering why a strange woman is living in your cabin. Beth turned back to the stove, but Samuel caught the tension in her shoulders. Despite her calm words, she was nervous too. The prospect of meeting his neighbors, of stepping into the social world she'd fled from, clearly worried her. They're good people, Samuel said, surprising himself with the reassurance. The Hendersons, they were kind to Margaret and me when we first settled here. They'll be kind to you too. Even when they learn I'm marrying the hermit of the mountains. Especially then. Mary's always said I needed a wife to civilize me. Beth's laugh was genuine and warm. Well, I'll do my best not to disappoint her expectations. As they prepared for their first venture into the wider world, Samuel found himself paying attention to details he'd ignored for years. How did his clothes look? Did his hair need cutting? What would people see when they looked at him and Beth together? The woman who emerged from his cabin that morning bore little resemblance to the desperate fugitive who'd arrived 3 days earlier. Beth had mended her torn dress with careful stitches, arranged her hair in a neat bun, and somehow managed to project an air of quiet dignity despite her simple clothes. She looked, Samuel realized, like exactly the kind of woman a reformed hermit might fall in love with, capable, pretty in an understated way, and possessed of the kind of inner strength that attracted good men. "How do I look?" she asked, smoothing her skirts nervously. "Like a woman worth waiting 7 years for," Samuel replied, then immediately felt heat rise in his face at his own boldness. But Beth smiled, a real smile that lit up her entire face. "Thank you. That's exactly what I was hoping for." The ride to the Henderson place took 2 hours through snow-covered forest trails that Samuel could navigate blindfolded. Beth rode Margaret's mare, a gentle chestnut named Patience, who'd spent the last 7 years with little to do but graze in Samuel's meadow. The horse seemed delighted to have a purpose again, stepping carefully through the snow with her ears pricked forward. "Tell me about them," Beth said as they rode. "The Hendersons. John's a good man, steady, reliable, doesn't judge people by their past mistakes. Mary's... Samuel paused, searching for diplomatic words. Mary's got opinions about everything, but her heart's in the right place. They have 3 children, all grown now, and moved away. Mary misses having people to take care of. She'll want to take care of me, probably. Is that all right with you? Beth considered this. I think I'd like that. It's been a long time since anyone wanted to take care of me. The Henderson homestead appeared through the trees like something from a storybook, a neat log house, with smoke rising from the chimney, outbuildings arranged in precise order, and the kind of tidy prosperity that spoke of years of hard work and careful planning. It was everything Samuel's place could be if he'd had the motivation to build rather than simply maintain. Mary Henderson must have spotted them coming, because she appeared on the front porch before they'd even dismounted, wiping her hands on her apron and calling for her husband. "Samuel Reed!" she exclaimed, genuine pleasure evident in her voice. "As I live and breathe! John, come out here. Samuel's finally come calling, and he's brought company." Beth dismounted gracefully and stood beside. Patience, her hands folded calmly in front of her, despite what Samuel could see was considerable nervousness. She looked, he thought, like a woman perfectly capable of holding her own in any social situation. John Henderson emerged from the barn, a tall man in his 60s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life working outdoors. His eyes went immediately to Beth, but his expression remained carefully neutral, the look of a man who'd learned not to jump to conclusions. "John, Mary," Samuel said, his voice rusty with disuse around other people, "I'd like you to meet Beth Morrison, my fiancée." The words hung in the cold air like visible breath. Mary's eyes widened with surprise and delight, while John's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Mary let out a whoop of joy that probably could be heard in the next county. "A fiancé! Oh, Samuel, this is wonderful! John, did you hear? Samuel's getting married!" She hurried down from the porch, her arms already extended toward Beth. "My dear girl, what a lovely surprise! Come in, come in. You must be frozen solid. John, help with the horses. Samuel Reed, you sly old fox, how long has this been going on?" Beth submitted to Mary's enthusiastic embrace with good grace, allowing herself to be swept up in the older woman's genuine excitement. Samuel caught her eye over Mary's shoulder and saw gratitude there, mixed with relief. The first hurdle had been cleared successfully. "Not long," Samuel replied honestly. "It's been sudden. The best things usually are," John said pragmatically, moving to take the horse's reins. "Love doesn't run on schedules." As they settled into the Hendersons' warm kitchen, with Mary bustling about preparing coffee and pressing food on them despite their protests, Samuel found himself remembering what it felt like to be part of a community. The easy conversation, the genuine interest in their lives, the assumption of goodwill that he'd forgotten existed among decent people. Beth fielded Mary's enthusiastic questions with skill and charm, revealing just enough about her background to satisfy curiosity without raising alarm. She'd been working as a seamstress. Yes. She'd met Samuel when she was traveling through the area. Yes, it had been love at first sight for both of them. No, they hadn't set a date yet, but soon. "A spring wedding would be lovely," Mary declared. "Though, I suppose, winter has its own charm. Nothing more romantic than a snowy mountainside ceremony." "We're hoping to have the circuit preacher perform the service," Beth said. "Something simple and quiet. Of course. Samuel's never been one for fuss and bother. But you must let me help with preparations. A wedding dress, at the very least. I still have my grandmother's lace. It would be perfect for you." Samuel watched Beth's face carefully. knowing that accepting such kindness would be difficult for someone who'd learned to be self-sufficient. But Beth nodded gracefully, understanding that Mary's offer was more than generosity, it was acceptance, an invitation into the community that Samuel had isolated himself from for so long. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Henderson. I'd be honored." "Mary, please, we're going to be neighbors after all." As the afternoon wore on, Samuel found himself relaxing in ways he'd forgotten were possible. The conversation flowed easily, touching on weather and local news, plans for spring planting, and gentle teasing about his years of bachelorhood. Beth fit seamlessly into the dynamic, contributing to conversations with the kind of thoughtful comments that marked her as both intelligent and well-mannered. When they finally took their leave, with promises to return soon and invitations to Sunday dinner, Samuel felt something he hadn't experienced in 7 years. He felt like he belonged somewhere again. "That went well," Beth said as they rode back toward the mountain. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. "Better than I expected," Samuel admitted. "Mary likes you. I like her too. She reminds me of my mother, the way she wants to take care of everyone." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Samuel found himself thinking about the easy way Beth had handled the afternoon, how naturally she'd stepped into the role of his intended wife. For a few hours, their arrangement had felt less like a desperate expedient and more like a genuine partnership. "Samuel?" Beth's voice was soft in the gathering dusk. "Yes, thank you. For today, for introducing me as your fiancé. She paused, searching for words. "For making me feel like I belong somewhere again." Samuel looked at her, noting the way the fading light softened her features and made her look younger, more vulnerable. "Thank you for making me remember what that feels like." As they climbed the final slope toward his cabin, Samuel realized that somewhere during the day, his mountain sanctuary had begun to feel like something else entirely. It had begun to feel like home. A week into their engagement, Samuel found himself standing in the doorway of his bedroom, staring at Margaret's music box as it sat on the small table beside the bed. The delicate wooden case, carved with roses and vines, had remained untouched since the day of her funeral. Now, with Beth moving quietly around the cabin behind him, preparing their evening meal, the music box seemed to pulse with significance he wasn't ready to confront. "You're thinking about her again," Beth said softly from the kitchen area. It wasn't a question. Samuel's shoulders tensed. "How did you know?" "You get a certain look, like you're seeing something I can't." Beth's voice held no judgment, only gentle observation. "It's all right, you know, to think about her." Samuel turned to face Beth, noting how naturally she'd assumed the domestic tasks he'd struggled with alone for so long. She moved through his space with increasing confidence, no longer asking permission for every small action. The change should have felt like an intrusion, but instead it brought a warmth to the cabin that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. "Do you think about your sister?" he asked. "Every day." Beth stirred the pot of stew she'd been preparing, the rich aroma filling the small space with the promise of a proper meal. "But differently now than I did right after she died. Then it was all grief and emptiness. Now it's more like—" She paused, searching for words. "Like having a conversation with someone who's not quite there." Samuel understood exactly what she meant. Margaret's presence had filled his cabin so completely during their brief marriage that her absence had been like a physical wound. For years, he'd preserved everything exactly as she'd left it, hoping somehow to keep her spirit alive in the unchanged rooms. But preservation wasn't the same as memory. and memory wasn't the same as moving forward. "Would you like to tell me about her?" Beth asked, settling into her chair by the fire with her mending in her lap. "About Margaret?" The question caught Samuel off guard. In 7 years, no one had asked him about his wife. People mentioned her death in passing, offered condolences when pressed, but no one had actually wanted to hear about who she'd been as a living, breathing woman. She was... Samuel struggled to find words that would capture Margaret's essence without diminishing it. She was the kind of person who made everything better just by being there, not because she tried to fix things, but because she saw the good in everything. What did she look like? Samuel moved to the mantelpiece and picked up the small daguerreotype he'd looked at 1,000 times. In the formal pose required by the long exposure, Margaret looked serious and dignified, but the photograph couldn't capture the way her eyes crinkled when she laughed or how she bit her lower lip when she was concentrating. Auburn hair, green eyes, about your height, but she carried herself taller. She had this way of looking at people that made them feel important. Samuel traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb. She wanted children. We both did. Spent hours planning how we'd expand the cabin, where we'd put the nursery. What happened to those plans? Buried them with her, I suppose. Samuel set the photograph back on the mantel, but didn't return to his chair. Seemed pointless to build for a future that wasn't coming. Beth was quiet for a moment, her needle moving steadily through the fabric in her lap. Maybe the future just looked different than you expected. The simple observation hit Samuel with unexpected force. For 7 years, he'd thought of his life as over, finished, a story that had reached its conclusion with Margaret's death. The idea that there might be other chapters, different but equally meaningful, was both terrifying and oddly liberating. "Tell me about your dreams," he said suddenly. "When you were young, what did you want your life to look like?" Beth's hands stilled on her mending. "That's a dangerous question for a woman in my position. We're engaged now. Your position has changed. Has it?" Beth looked up at him with those intelligent eyes. "Sometimes I'm not sure if this is real or just a very elaborate form of hiding." Samuel moved to sit across from her, leaning forward to rest his forearms on his knees. "What do you mean?" "I mean that a week ago I was running from one man who wanted to control my life. Now I'm promised to another man, and I'm not entirely sure what the difference is." The words stung because they contained a grain of truth Samuel hadn't wanted to acknowledge. In proposing marriage to protect Beth from Blackwood, had he simply offered her a different form of captivity? "The difference is choice," he said finally. "You can leave any time you want. This engagement, this marriage, it's not a prison. But you need it to be real enough to fool Blackwood and the courts. How real is too real?" It was a fair question, and one that had been troubling Samuel's thoughts more each day. Their arrangement had started as a practical solution to a legal problem, but living together, sharing meals and conversations, and the intimate details of daily life had begun to blur the lines between performance and reality. "I don't know," Samuel admitted. "I've never been in this situation before." "Neither have I," Beth resumed her sewing, but her movements were less steady than before. "In town, before all this happened, I used to watch married couples and wonder what it would be like to have someone who chose you, who wanted to build a life with you, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Is that what you dreamed about? Marriage?" "Among other things, I wanted to travel, to see places beyond the Wyoming Territory. I wanted to read books I'd never heard of, to learn things I'd never had time to study. I wanted to feel useful, but not just for washing clothes or mending tears." Beth's voice grew wistful. "I suppose I wanted to matter to someone in a way that had nothing to do with what I could do for them. Samuel felt something twist in his chest. You matter to me. Because I cook your meals and wash your clothes? Because you make this place feel alive again? Beth looked up from her mending, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. Do I? Or do I just remind you of what it used to feel like when Margaret was here? The question hung between them like smoke, and Samuel realized he didn't have a ready answer. Was his growing attachment to Beth based on who she was, or simply on his desperate loneliness and her resemblance to the domestic happiness he'd lost? I don't know, he said honestly. Maybe both. Does that make it less real? I don't know either. Beth set aside her mending and stood, moving to the window that looked out over the moonlit landscape. Sometimes I feel like I'm living in someone else's life, wearing someone else's clothes, sleeping in someone else's bed, trying to fill a space that was never meant for me. Samuel joined her at the window, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from her body, but careful not to touch. Margaret's been gone for 7 years. Whatever space she occupied, it's not the same space you're filling now. Isn't it? Beth turned to face him. You still wear your wedding ring. Her clothes still hang in the wardrobe. Her music box sits beside the bed like a shrine. How am I supposed to know where she ends and I begin? Samuel looked down at his left hand, at the gold band he'd worn for so long it had become part of his flesh. He'd put it on the morning of his wedding to Margaret and never removed it, not even during the darkest days of his grief, when its weight felt like a chain around his heart. Maybe that's the problem, he said quietly. Maybe I've been so busy preserving the past that I forgot how to live in the present. Or maybe the past is too important to let go of. Or maybe there's a difference between honoring the past and being imprisoned by it. They stood in silence for a moment, both staring out at the snow-covered landscape that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. In the distance, Samuel could see the lights of the Henderson place, warm and welcoming in the darkness. A reminder that other people had found ways to build lives that honored both memory and hope. What if we tried something? Beth said suddenly. What kind of something? What if, for one evening, we pretended this was real? Not an arrangement or a convenience, but an actual courtship between two people who are genuinely interested in each other. Samuel's heart began to beat faster. What would that look like? I don't know. Conversation that isn't about practical matters. Maybe you could tell me something about yourself that has nothing to do with survival or grief. And I could tell you something about myself that has nothing to do with running away or being grateful for rescue. It was a dangerous proposition, Samuel realized, to step out of the safe roles they'd established and risk discovering what might exist between them if circumstances were different. But the longing in Beth's voice, the hope that she was trying so hard to keep carefully controlled, made the risk seem worthwhile. All right, he said, one evening, but I warn you, I'm out of practice at courtship. Beth's smile was the first completely unguarded expression he'd seen from her. So am I. I suppose we'll have to figure it out together. Samuel moved to the small shelf where he kept his few precious books, pulling down a volume of poetry that had belonged to his grandfather. Margaret used to like this, he said, then caught himself. Sorry, I didn't mean to. It's all right, Beth said gently. The fact that she liked poetry doesn't mean I can't like it too. What kind of poetry? Wordsworth, mostly. Some Byron, a few American poets I'd never heard of before. Would you read to me? The request was simple, but it felt monumentally significant. Samuel hadn't read aloud since Margaret's death, hadn't shared the pleasure of language and rhythm and meaning with another human being in 7 years. The prospect of opening that part of himself again felt both terrifying and necessary. "I'd like that," he said. As they settled by the fire, Beth in her chair and Samuel in his own, the book open on his lap, Samuel felt something shift between them. Not the careful politeness of their arrangement, nor the practical partnership they'd been building, but something warmer and more fragile. Something that might, with time and care, grow into the kind of genuine affection that made marriage more than just a legal convenience. "What should I read first?" he asked. "Surprise me," Beth replied, her eyes bright with anticipation. Samuel opened the book and began to read, his voice rusty at first but growing stronger with each line. Outside, the wind whispered through the pine trees, and inside, two lonely people began the careful work of discovering who they might become together. The morning after their evening of poetry and honest conversation, Samuel woke with an unfamiliar sense of purpose. For the first time in 7 years, he had a reason to build rather than simply maintain. Beth's suggestion about expanding the root cellar and repairing the shed had taken root in his mind, growing into something larger, a vision of what their life together could become if they chose to invest in a shared future. He found Beth already awake, standing at the kitchen counter, examining his woodworking tools with the focused attention she brought to everything. The chisels, planes and saws lay arranged on a clean cloth, their edges gleaming in the morning light. Samuel had cleaned and maintained them meticulously over the years, but he hadn't used them for any significant project since Margaret's death. "These are beautiful," Beth said, running her finger along the smooth handle of a hand plane. "My father had tools like these. He was a stout carpenter before." She stopped, then continued more quietly. "Before the gambling took over his life." Samuel joined her at the counter, picking up a chisel he'd inherited from his own father. The tool fit his hand perfectly, worn smooth by decades of use. What did he build? Everything. Furniture, cabinets, even helped raise a few barns in the area. He taught me some basics: how to measure twice and cut once, how to read wood grain, how to join pieces so they'll last. Beth's smile was tinged with sadness. "I used to help him in his workshop when I was young, before he started drinking, before everything fell apart." "Show me," Samuel said impulsively. Beth looked surprised. "Show you what?" "What he taught you. I've been thinking about that shed repair you mentioned, and the root cellar expansion. I could use help with the planning." It was partially true. Samuel had been thinking about those projects, but more than that, he wanted to see Beth's face light up the way it had when she'd spoken about her father's carpentry. He wanted to share something meaningful with her, something that had nothing to do with their practical arrangement or their complicated past. Beth picked up a measuring tape and began examining the door frame of the cabin with professional interest. "This is good work," she said, running her hands along the joints. "Whoever built this knew what they were doing." "That would be me," Samuel said with a trace of pride. "Margaret and I built most of it ourselves, with some help from John Henderson. You did beautiful work. The joints are tight, the corners are square." Beth paused at a section where 2 logs met, though this corner could use some attention. The chinking's starting to fail. Samuel moved to look where she pointed, noting the small gap where the clay and moss mixture had begun to crumble away. He'd been meaning to repair it for months, but had kept putting it off. Maintenance felt different when someone else would benefit from the comfort. "We could fix that today," he said. "If you want to help, I'd like that." They spent the morning working together on the exterior repairs, Beth proving surprisingly skilled at mixing chinking material and applying it with the right consistency. She worked with the methodical precision of someone who understood that details mattered, that taking time to do things properly the first time saved work later. "Your father taught you well," Samuel observed, watching her smooth a section of chinking with practiced movements. "He was a good teacher when he was sober, patient, careful, willing to explain things until I understood." Beth's voice carried the complicated emotions of someone remembering a parent who'd been both loving and destructive. "I think he would have liked you, even knowing I'm twice your age and lived as a hermit for 7 years. Especially knowing that. He understood the appeal of hiding from the world when it becomes too much to bear." Samuel paused in his work, struck by her insight. "Is that what you think I was doing? Hiding? Weren't you?" It was a fair question, and one Samuel had been avoiding asking himself. Maybe, at first, anyway. After Margaret died, everything outside this cabin felt dangerous, unpredictable. Here, I could control what happened, make sure nothing else could hurt me. But hiding doesn't heal the hurt, it just preserves it. And you? Were you hiding too? In your sewing room above the dress shop? Beth considered this as she worked. Yes, but differently. You chose your isolation. Mine was forced on me by circumstances, taking care of Annie, working to survive, then running from Blackwood. I never had the luxury of withdrawing completely. Maybe that's why you're better at this than I am. At what? At being around people. At building something new instead of just maintaining something old. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythmic scraping of tools and the occasional murmur of conversation creating an intimacy Samuel hadn't experienced since his early days with Margaret. But this felt different, somehow less urgent, more seasoned. The desperate passion of youth replaced by something steadier and more mature. "Samuel," Beth said eventually, her voice thoughtful, "when we marry, when the preacher comes, what kind of wedding do you want?" The question caught him off guard. In all their practical discussions about marriage as protection from Blackwood, they'd never talked about the ceremony itself, about what it would mean to them personally rather than legally. "I hadn't thought much about it," he admitted. "With Margaret, we had a church wedding in town. Her family, my family, half the county in attendance, big celebration afterward." "Do you want that again?" Samuel considered this as he worked. The memory of his first wedding was complicated joy, mixed with the pain of remembering it in Margaret's absence, love shadowed by loss. "No," he said finally, "that was for different people in a different time. This should be something that belongs to us." "What would that look like?" "Simple, quiet. Maybe just the preacher and a witness or two. Mary Henderson would never forgive us if we didn't include her." Beth smiled at that. "I think I'd like Mary to be there. She's already treating me like a daughter. She lost her own daughters, young one to fever, one to childbirth complications. Having you to fuss over means a lot to her. And you? Does having someone to fuss over mean something to you too?" Samuel stopped working and looked at Beth directly. She was watching him with those intelligent eyes, not pushing for an answer, but clearly hoping for honesty. "Yes," he said simply. "It does." The admission hung between them like morning mist, present but fragile. Samuel found himself thinking about the small changes Beth had brought to his life, the way she hummed while she worked, how she organized his books by subject rather than size, the careful way she mended not just torn fabric, but tears in the very fabric of his daily existence. "There's something I need to tell you," Beth said, her voice taking on a more serious tone. Samuel's chest tightened with sudden anxiety. "What?" "Yesterday, when we went to the Hendersons, Mary mentioned that the circuit preacher is expected next week. She suggested we might want to speak with him about performing our ceremony. That's good news. It means we need to make a decision, about whether this marriage is still just a practical arrangement or whether it's becoming something more. Samuel set down his tools and faced Beth fully. What do you think it's becoming? I think it's becoming real, whether we intended it to or not, whether it's wise or not, whether we're ready for it or not. Beth's voice was steady, but Samuel could see the vulnerability in her eyes. I think we're both pretending this is just convenience, when it stopped being convenient the moment we started caring about each other. Are you saying you care about me? I'm saying I care about us, about what we're building here, about the way you read poetry with your whole heart, and the way you look at me like I'm someone worth protecting, and the way this cabin feels like home when we're both in it. Samuel felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen. I care about us too. More than I expected to, more than I thought I could after Margaret. So what do we do with that? We be honest about it. We stop pretending this is just a business arrangement and acknowledge that somewhere along the way it became a courtship. Beth's smile was radiant. I'd like that. I'd like to court you properly, Samuel Reed. To learn what kind of husband you might be when you're not just trying to save someone. And I'd like to learn what kind of wife you might be when you're not just running from someone. They returned to their work with a new energy, the simple repairs taking on the quality of nest building. Samuel found himself paying attention to details that hadn't mattered when he was just maintaining, making sure the chinking was not just functional but attractive, taking extra care with the smoothness of the surfaces. Beth would touch daily. Tell me about the furniture you want to build, Beth said as they worked. For our home. Our home. The phrase sent warmth through Samuel's chest. A proper dining table for one thing, something large enough for guests. Guests? The Hendersons, for Sunday dinners. Maybe other neighbors. Maybe... Samuel paused, then continued with careful hope. Maybe family. Someday. Beth's hands stilled on her work. What kind of family? Whatever kind we choose to build. Children, if we're blessed with them. Neighbors who become like family. People who need a place to belong. Like I needed a place to belong. Like we both needed a place to belong. As the day wore on, Samuel found himself thinking about the future in ways he hadn't allowed himself to consider in 7 years. Not the careful, limited future of a man simply trying to survive until his next meal, but the expansive future of someone who had reasons to plan and build and hope. That evening, as they sat by the fire sharing another simple meal that Beth had somehow transformed into something special, Samuel reached across the small table and took her hand. Her fingers were work-roughened but gentle, capable of both delicate sewing and sturdy repairs. "When the preacher comes," he said quietly, "I want to marry you because I choose you. Not because of Blackwood or contracts or legal protection, but because I want to build a life with you." Beth's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Even knowing it might not be the grand passion you had with Margaret, maybe it doesn't need to be. Maybe it can be something different but equally valuable. Something built on choice and respect and shared work." "And affection?" Samuel squeezed her hand gently. "Definitely affection." "Then yes, Samuel Reed, when the preacher comes, I'll marry you because I choose you too." Outside, the wind whispered through the pine trees, and inside, two people who had found each other by accident began the intentional work of building something that might last a lifetime. The sound of approaching horses shattered the peaceful morning like gunshots through glass. Samuel looked up from the fence post he was setting, his entire body going rigid with alertness. Beth, who had been hanging laundry on the line they'd strung between two pine trees, dropped the wet shirt she was holding and moved instinctively toward the cabin. "How many?" she whispered, though the riders were still too distant to hear normal conversation. Samuel shielded his eyes against the morning sun, counting the dark shapes picking their way up the mountain trail. 4, maybe 5. Beth's face went pale. It has to be. Samuel was already moving toward the cabin, his mind shifting into the careful calculations of a man who'd learned to survive by thinking 3 steps ahead of trouble. Get inside. Stay away from the windows. Samuel, now Beth. She obeyed without further argument, understanding that this wasn't the time for discussion. Samuel followed her into the cabin, moving immediately to the gun rack mounted above the fireplace. His rifles were clean and ready, as they always were, but he'd hoped never to need them for anything more dangerous than hunting deer. The riders crested the final rise as Samuel positioned himself at the window with the best view of the approach. Even at a distance, he recognized Jeremiah Blackwood's bulky frame and confident posture. The man rode like someone accustomed to owning everything he could see, his 3 companions flanking him in a formation that spoke of practiced intimidation. But it was the 5th rider that made Samuel's blood run cold. A tall man in a dark coat, wearing the unmistakable badge of a territorial sheriff. They brought the law, Samuel said grimly. Beth pressed herself against the wall beside the window, staying out of sight but close enough to hear. That's Sheriff Morrison. He's Blackwood's cousin. Samuel's jaw tightened. A corrupt sheriff made the situation infinitely more complicated. Even if they were legally in the right, which was far from certain, Morrison could arrest Samuel on trumped-up charges and drag Beth away before any higher authority could intervene. The riders pulled up in the yard with deliberate showmanship, their horses snorting and stamping in the cold morning air. Blackwood dismounted with the casual arrogance of a man who expected the world to accommodate his convenience, while his men remained mounted, hands resting meaningfully on their weapons. "Samuel Reed!" Blackwood called out, his voice carrying the false joviality of a predator playing with its prey. "I know you're in there. Come out and let's discuss this like civilized men." Samuel glanced at Beth, noting the way her hands trembled despite her efforts to appear calm. "Stay here," he murmured, then opened the cabin door and stepped onto the porch, his rifle held casually but ready. "Blackwood," he acknowledged, his voice steady and neutral. "You're a long way from your usual territory." "Indeed I am, but a man has to protect his interests, doesn't he?" Blackwood's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "I believe you have something that belongs to me. I don't recall borrowing anything from you. Now, Samuel, let's not play games. You know why I'm here." Blackwood gestured toward the cabin. "Beth Morrison is legally contracted to marry me. Her father's debt, properly witnessed and recorded. I've come to collect what's mine." Sheriff Morrison urged his horse forward, unfolding a paper from his coat pocket. "I've got a warrant here for the return of stolen property," he announced in a voice that carried the bored authority of a man who'd performed this routine many times before. "Stolen property? What?" Samuel's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Are we talking about a person or livestock?" "The law doesn't distinguish when it comes to breach of contract," Morrison replied. "Miss Morrison is legally bound to honor her father's agreement. Miss Morrison is no longer available to honor that agreement." Blackwood's smile faltered slightly. "What do you mean?" Samuel took a step forward, his rifle still held ready. "I mean she's engaged to marry someone else. Me." The words hit Blackwood like a physical blow. His face flushed red, and his hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip before one of his men caught his eye and shook his head slightly. "That's impossible," Blackwood sputtered. "She can't marry anyone else. She's bound by legal contract to me." "Actually," said a new voice from behind the cabin, "that's not entirely accurate." Everyone turned to see circuit preacher William Hayes emerging from the tree line, his black coat dusted with snow and his weathered face wearing the patient expression of a man accustomed to mediating disputes. Samuel felt a surge of relief mixed with confusion. He hadn't expected the preacher for another week. "Preacher Hayes," Sheriff Morrison said, his tone noticeably more respectful, "what brings you up here so early?" "Mary Henderson sent word that there was to be a wedding," Hayes replied, moving to stand beside Samuel on the porch. "I arrived last night and stayed with the Hendersons. This morning, I came up to discuss the ceremony with the happy couple." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "There is no happy couple. That woman is legally mine." Hayes reached into his coat and produced a leather portfolio stuffed with papers. "Actually, Mr. Blackwood, I took the liberty of reviewing the relevant territorial laws last night. Marriage contracts signed by fathers on behalf of daughters become void under several specific circumstances." "Such as?" Morrison demanded, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Such as when the daughter in question has already entered into a legally recognized engagement with another party." Hayes opened his portfolio and consulted a handwritten page. "According to Territorial Statute 247, subsection C, a woman cannot be held to a marriage contract if she has formally accepted a proposal from another man, provided that proposal was made and accepted before the original contract was to be fulfilled." Samuel felt hope beginning to bloom in his chest, but he kept his expression carefully neutral. "And if such an engagement exists, then the original contract becomes unenforceable, regardless of any debts or obligations involved." Hayes looked directly at Blackwood. "The law assumes that a woman's consent to marriage takes precedence over any agreement made without her participation." Blackwood's face was now a dangerous shade of purple. "This is ridiculous. You can't just—" "Actually, I can," Hayes interrupted mildly. "As a licensed minister of the Territorial Church, I have the authority to solemnize marriages and to recognize formal engagements. If Mr. Reed and Miss Morrison wish to be married, I can perform the ceremony right now." "Right now?" Beth's voice came from the cabin doorway, where she had appeared despite Samuel's instructions to stay hidden. Hayes smiled at her with genuine warmth. "If you're willing, my dear. The law is quite clear: once you're married, any previous contract becomes permanently void." Samuel looked at Beth, seeing the hope and fear warring in her expression. This wasn't how they'd planned it. They'd intended to court properly, to marry when they were ready, to build their relationship on solid ground before making it legal and permanent. But sometimes life forced choices before people felt ready to make them. "Beth," Samuel said quietly, "it's your decision." She looked at him for a long moment, then at Blackwood, whose face promised nothing but cruelty and possession. When she spoke, her voice was clear and strong. "Yes," she said, "I want to marry Samuel Reed, right now." Blackwood exploded into motion, dismounting and striding toward the cabin with his hand on his gun. "Like hell you will. Sheriff, arrest this man for kidnapping and interference with a legal contract." But Morrison was studying the papers Hayes had produced, his expression troubled. "Jeremiah, if the preacher's right about the law is what I say it is." "Actually," Hayes said, with the calm authority of a man accustomed to dealing with bullies, "the law is what the territorial legislature says it is. And they've been quite specific about women's rights in marriage contracts." Samuel stepped forward, his rifle now held in a more obviously threatening position. "You heard the lady, Blackwood. She's made her choice." "This isn't over," Blackwood snarled, but he stepped back. Even his arrogance wasn't quite enough to overcome the combination of an armed mountain man, a legal preacher, and increasingly dubious law enforcement. "Actually, it is," Hayes said mildly. "Once the ceremony is performed, your contract becomes null and void. Permanently." Blackwood looked around at the assembled group, Samuel with his rifle, Beth standing resolute in the cabin doorway, Hayes with his legal documents, even Morrison looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. The calculation in his eyes was visible. He could start a shooting war on Samuel's property, but it wouldn't get him what he wanted, and it might get him killed. "This isn't over," he repeated, but the threat sounded hollow now. "You can't hide up here forever." "We're not hiding," Samuel replied. "We're building a life. There's a difference." As Blackwood and his men mounted their horses and rode away, their departure marked by muttered threats and angry glances, Samuel felt something settle in his chest that had been tense for days. The immediate danger was over, but he knew Blackwood's type. Men like that didn't give up easily, especially when their pride had been wounded in front of witnesses. "Well then," Hayes said cheerfully, apparently untroubled by the confrontation, "shall we proceed with the ceremony? I find that nothing settles legal disputes quite like a properly performed marriage." Beth looked at Samuel, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears or might have been laughter. "Are you ready to become a married man again, Samuel Reed?" Samuel thought about all the careful courtship they'd planned, all the time they'd intended to spend getting to know each other before making their arrangement permanent. Then he thought about the alternative, watching Blackwood drag Beth away, knowing he could have prevented it, but chose to wait for a more convenient time. "I'm ready," he said, and meant it completely. As Hayes opened his prayer book and began the ancient words that would bind their lives together, Samuel realized that sometimes the most important moments in life arrived without warning, demanding immediate decision and absolute faith. Looking at Beth as she repeated her vows, her voice steady despite everything they'd just endured, Samuel felt certain they were making the right choice, even if they were making it for all the wrong reasons. The marriage ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes, performed on Samuel's front porch with the Wyoming mountains as witness and the echo of Blackwood's threats still hanging in the crisp air. When Preacher Hayes pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel felt the weight of his wedding ring, Margaret's ring, shift on his finger, as if the gold itself recognized that its meaning had changed. Beth Reed, stood beside him in Margaret's blue dress, her hand steady in his as they faced their uncertain future together. The kiss that sealed their union was brief and respectful, but Samuel felt something profound settle between them, a commitment that went beyond legal protection to something deeper and more enduring. "Well," Hayes said, closing his prayer book with satisfaction, "that should settle the legal matter quite thoroughly. Mr. Blackwood will find it very difficult to contest a marriage performed by a licensed minister with proper witnesses." Samuel glanced toward the tree line where John Henderson had emerged during the ceremony, drawn by the commotion and staying to serve as witness. The older man's presence was both comforting and significant. Word of their marriage would spread through the community within hours, providing the social validation that might matter as much as legal documents. "What happens now?" Beth asked quietly, her eyes still fixed on the trail where Blackwood had disappeared. "Now you build a life together," Hayes replied, with the practical wisdom of a man who'd married hundreds of couples over the years. "The legal battle is over, but the real work is just beginning." Samuel knew the preacher was right, but he also knew that Blackwood's retreat didn't necessarily mean surrender. Men like Jeremiah Blackwood didn't accept defeat gracefully, especially when that defeat had been witnessed by others. The threat to Beth might be legally resolved, but the threat to both of them was far from over. As Hayes and Henderson took their leave, promising to spread word of the marriage throughout the community, Samuel found himself alone with his new wife for the first time since their hasty ceremony. The cabin felt different somehow, no longer his solitary sanctuary, but the beginning of their shared home. "How do you feel?" he asked, noting the way Beth touched her wedding ring, Margaret's ring, which Hayes had blessed and placed on her finger with solemn ceremony. "Married?" she said with a small laugh that held both joy and uncertainty. "It's strange. An hour ago I was Beth Morrison, a woman running from an unwanted marriage. Now I'm Beth Reed, a woman who chose her own marriage. The difference feels enormous." Samuel understood exactly what she meant. The ceremony had been rushed and driven by necessity, but it had also been real. They had chosen each other, made vows before God and witnesses, bound their lives together with words that carried the weight of eternity. "Do you regret it?" he asked. "No." Beth's answer came without hesitation. "Do you?" Samuel looked down at his left hand, where Margaret's ring caught the afternoon light. For 7 years, it had been a monument to the past, a chain that held him to grief and memory. Now it felt different, not a burden but a bridge, connecting what he had been to what he was becoming. "No," he said. "But I think we need to be prepared for what comes next." Beth's expression grew serious. "You think Blackwood will come back?" "I know he will. Men like that don't give up when they're challenged publicly. His pride won't let him accept defeat, especially from a hermit and a runaway bride." They spent the afternoon making practical preparations for what they both knew was coming. Samuel cleaned and loaded his rifles, checked his ammunition supply, and positioned weapons strategically around the cabin. Beth helped with grim efficiency, her hands steady as she measured powder and counted cartridges. "Have you ever shot anyone?" she asked as they worked. "No." "You?" "No, but I will if I have to." The quiet determination in her voice reminded Samuel that his new wife was not a delicate flower in need of protection, but a woman who had survived loss, poverty, and desperation through her own strength and will. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. As evening approached, Samuel found himself studying the marriage certificate that Preacher Hayes had left with them. The document was simple but official, bearing the territorial seal and Hayes's careful signature. It represented Beth's freedom and their legal union, but it also felt fragile somehow, just paper and ink against the violence and corruption that Blackwood represented. "Samuel," Beth said from where she stood at the window, watching the trail that led down from their mountain sanctuary, "I need to tell you something about Blackwood. Something I should have mentioned before." Samuel's attention sharpened. "What?" "He's not just cruel. He's dangerous in ways that go beyond just being a bad husband." Beth's hands twisted in her apron, Margaret's apron, which she'd taken to wearing during her domestic work. There were rumors in town about his previous wives, about how they died. What kind of rumors? That their deaths weren't as natural as the doctor claimed. That both women tried to leave him before they died, and both were found dead under suspicious circumstances. Samuel felt cold anger settle in his chest. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I hoped we'd never have to deal with him again. Because I thought if we married quietly and stayed out of his way, he'd eventually give up and find someone else to torment." Beth turned from the window to face him. "I was naive. Men like Blackwood don't give up, they escalate." The implications of her words hit Samuel like a physical blow. Blackwood wasn't just a bully who wanted his property back. He was a man capable of murder, with a history of eliminating problems that couldn't be solved through intimidation. "Then we need to be ready for more than just another confrontation," Samuel said grimly. They worked through the evening by lamplight, preparing their home for siege. Samuel boarded up the windows that faced the most likely approach routes, leaving narrow slots that would allow them to see and shoot without exposing themselves. Beth helped him move furniture to create defensive positions and gathered supplies, food, water, medical supplies in easily defended areas of the cabin. As they worked, Samuel found himself thinking about the marriage certificate Preacher Hayes had given them. The document that should have represented joy and hope now felt like a target painted on their backs. Blackwood would see their marriage not as the end of his claim, but as a direct challenge to his authority, an insult that demanded violent response. "There's something else," Samuel said as they secured the last of the defensive preparations. "Something I need you to understand about what might happen." Beth looked up from the medical supplies she was organizing. "What? If Blackwood comes back when he comes back, it won't be just to take you away. It'll be to make an example, to show everyone what happens when someone defies him." "You mean he'll try to kill us both?" "I mean he'll try to do worse than that. He'll want our deaths to send a message to anyone else who might think about standing up to him." Beth was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the implications of what Samuel had said. When she spoke, her voice was steady but grim. "Then we make sure he doesn't succeed. This isn't your fight, Beth. You could still leave." "Stop." Beth's voice cut through his words like a blade. "This became my fight the moment I said yes to marrying you. We're in this together now, Samuel Reed. For better or worse, as the preacher said." Samuel looked at his wife noting the steel in her spine and the determination in her eyes. 7 years of solitude had made him forget what it felt like to have someone choose to stand beside him in the face of danger. The feeling was both humbling and strengthening. "All right," he said. "Together." They spent their wedding night not in celebration but in preparation, taking turns, keeping watch while the other rested fitfully. Samuel found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken from hermit to husband in the span of 2 weeks, from a man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone to someone responsible for protecting another person's life. But as he watched Beth sleep in the bed they now shared, her breathing soft, and even despite the danger that surrounded them, Samuel realized that the responsibility didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. For the first time since Margaret's death, he had something worth fighting for. Dawn came cold and clear, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold. Samuel woke to the sound of horses on the trail below, multiple riders, moving with the deliberate pace of men who were in no hurry because they expected no resistance. "Beth," he said softly, his hand on her shoulder, "they're coming." She woke instantly, her eyes clear and alert. "How many?" Samuel moved to the window and peered through the narrow slot they'd left for observation. Down the trail, he could see at least 8 riders, all heavily armed and moving with military precision. Blackwood rode at their head, but these weren't the same men who'd accompanied him the day before. These were professionals, hired guns, who killed for money and asked no questions. 8 that I can see, maybe more in the trees. Beth joined him at the window, her face pale but determined. "Professional killers." "Looks like it. So what do we do?" Samuel checked his rifle one final time, then looked at his wife with something that might have been a smile. "We show them what happens when they threaten our home." As the riders drew closer, Samuel felt the last of his old life fall away, like a discarded coat. The hermit who had hidden in these mountains for 7 years was gone, replaced by a man with something to protect and someone to protect it with. The battle for their future was about to begin. The gavel of Territorial Judge Marcus Whitman sat heavy in his weathered hands as he studied the documents spread across the makeshift table in the Hendersons' front parlor. Samuel had never expected to see formal justice come to the Wyoming mountains, but word of their situation had reached the territorial capital faster than anyone anticipated, and Judge Whitman had ridden hard to reach them before violence could erupt. "This is highly irregular," the judge said, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades on the territorial bench. "I don't usually hold court in private homes." Samuel stood beside Beth in the Hendersons' parlor, acutely aware of the 8 armed men waiting outside with Jeremiah Blackwood. The judge's unexpected arrival had created a standoff. Blackwood couldn't very well murder people in front of a territorial judge, and Samuel couldn't risk a gunfight with an officer of the court present. "Nevertheless," Judge Whitman continued, "the allegations brought to my attention are serious enough to warrant immediate investigation." He looked up at Blackwood, who sat rigidly in John Henderson's best chair, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. "Mr. Blackwood, you claim this woman is legally bound to marry you under territorial contract law." "That's correct, Your Honor. Her father signed a legal agreement, properly witnessed and filed with the county clerk." Blackwood's voice was steady, but Samuel could see the calculation in his eyes as he tried to determine how much the judge knew. "And you, Mrs. Reed," Judge Whitman turned to Beth, "claim that you were coerced into this arrangement and that your subsequent marriage to Mr. Reed invalidates the original contract." "Yes, Your Honor." Beth's voice was clear and strong, showing none of the fear Samuel knew she felt. "I was given no choice in my father's agreement, and I fled rather than submit to a marriage I did not consent to." Judge Whitman nodded thoughtfully, then opened a leather portfolio that had been resting beside his elbow. "Before we proceed, there are some additional documents that have come to my attention, documents that cast considerable doubt on Mr. Blackwood's character and his fitness as a husband." Samuel felt a spark of hope, but Blackwood's face went white with something that might have been fear. "What documents?" Blackwood demanded. "Death certificates, for one thing. Specifically, the death certificates of your 2 previous wives." Judge Whitman's voice took on a harder edge, "along with testimony from several witnesses who have come forward since news of this case reached Cheyenne." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the Hendersons' mantel clock. Mary Henderson, who had insisted on serving tea despite the tense circumstances, stopped pouring mid-cup and stared at the judge with wide eyes. "I don't know what you're implying," Blackwood began. "I'm not implying anything, Mr. Blackwood. I'm stating facts." Judge Whitman pulled out a thick sheaf of papers. "Dr. Franklin Morrison of Cheyenne has submitted a formal statement questioning the circumstances of both deaths. It seems that your first wife, Elizabeth, sought his help for injuries consistent with repeated physical abuse just weeks before her death." Samuel felt Beth's hand slip into his, her fingers cold but steady. This was more than they had hoped for, not just legal protection but actual justice. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "your second wife, Catherine, confided in several women in town that she feared for her life and was planning to leave you. She died 3 days later of what was ruled accidental poisoning." "These are lies." Blackwood shot to his feet, his careful composure finally cracking. "Malicious gossip from jealous women and incompetent doctors. Sit down, Mr. Blackwood." Judge Whitman's voice cracked like a whip. "I'm not finished." Blackwood remained standing for a moment, his hands clenched into fists, before slowly sinking back into his chair. "The territorial government has been investigating reports of corruption and violence in this region for several months," Judge Whitman said. "Your name has come up repeatedly, in connection with forced marriages, suspicious deaths, and intimidation of witnesses. This case may be the key to a much larger prosecution. Samuel could hardly believe what he was hearing. What had started as a desperate attempt to protect Beth from an unwanted marriage had become part of a territorial investigation into Blackwood's crimes. "Now then," Judge Whitman said, lifting his gavel with ceremonial gravity, "let us address the matter at hand. Mr. Blackwood, your contract with Miss Morrison's father is hereby declared null and void on multiple grounds. First, because the woman in question has lawfully married another man. Second, because the original contract was signed under duress and without the consent of the bride. And third, because your history of violence makes you an unfit candidate for marriage under territorial law." The gavel came down with a sound like thunder. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "you are hereby ordered to cease all contact with Mr. and Mrs. Reed and to remove yourself from this county pending a full investigation into the deaths of your previous wives." Blackwood's face had gone from white to purple, his entire body trembling with rage. "You can't do this. I have rights. I have property interests. What you have, Mr. Blackwood, is a choice." Judge Whitman's voice was ice-cold. "You can leave this county voluntarily and submit to questioning in Cheyenne, or you can be arrested on suspicion of murder and transported there in chains. Which would you prefer?" The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, Samuel could hear the nervous stamping of horses and the low murmur of Blackwood's hired men, who were undoubtedly wondering what was taking so long. Blackwood looked around the room at Judge Whitman with his implacable authority, at Samuel standing protectively beside Beth, at the Hendersons, whose faces showed nothing but disgust for what they had learned about him. "This isn't over," he said finally, his voice low and dangerous. "Actually," Judge Whitman replied, bringing his gavel down one final time, "it is." Beth's new dress, a simple but elegant gown of deep blue wool that Mary Henderson had helped her sew from fabric, brought by the territorial judge, rustled softly as she stood beside Samuel in the formal aftermath of Blackwood's legal defeat. The dress represented more than just clothing. It was a symbol of her reclaimed dignity, her new status as a respected member of the community, and her transformation from a desperate fugitive into a woman who had chosen her own destiny. But even as Judge Whitman gathered his papers and prepared to escort Blackwood to Cheyenne for questioning, Beth could see the dangerous glitter in her former tormentor's eyes. Legal defeat was one thing, accepting that defeat was another entirely. "Your Honor," Blackwood said, his voice deceptively calm as he stood to leave, "I respect the court's decision, of course, but I trust you understand that a man's reputation is important to him, important enough to defend." Judge Whitman looked up sharply. "Are you threatening this court, Mr. Blackwood?" "Not at all. Simply observing that justice takes many forms, and court decisions don't always reflect the full truth of a situation." Samuel felt every muscle in his body tense. Blackwood was laying groundwork for future retaliation, making it clear that while he might submit to legal authority in the moment, he considered this far from over. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Whitman said, rising to his full height and fixing the man with a stare that had cowed territorial legislators, "let me be absolutely clear. Any attempt to harass, intimidate, or harm Mr. and Mrs. Reed will be considered contempt of this court and will result in your immediate arrest. Do I make myself understood?" "Perfectly, Your Honor." But as Blackwood gathered his hat and coat, Beth caught the look he directed at her, a look that promised retribution regardless of what any judge might say. She had known men like Blackwood her entire life, Men who saw women as property and any defiance of their will as a personal insult that demanded violent response. The formal proceedings concluded with handshakes and polite farewells, but Beth noticed that Samuel kept his rifle close at hand, even as they watched Blackwood and his men ride away under the judge's escort. The immediate legal crisis was over, but the deeper danger remained. "He'll be back," Beth said quietly, as the last of the riders disappeared down the mountain trail. "Not if the territorial prosecutors do their job," Mary Henderson said firmly, bustling about to clean up the impromptu courtroom her parlor had become. "That man belongs in prison, and now they have the evidence to put him there." But Samuel's expression was grim. Legal evidence and successful prosecution are two different things. Blackwood has money and connections. Men like that don't go down easy. Judge Whitman, who had lingered to speak privately with Samuel and Beth, nodded gravely. "Mr. Reed is correct to be cautious. While I'm confident we can build a strong case against Blackwood, the territorial courts move slowly, and dangerous men often act faster than the law can stop them." "What are you suggesting?" Beth asked. "That you remain vigilant, that you build connections within your community, people who can serve as witnesses and allies, and that you document everything." The judge reached into his portfolio and produced a thick stack of paper. "Keep records, dates, times, witnesses to any contact Blackwood might attempt. The law works best when it has clear evidence to work with." As the judge prepared to leave, Beth found herself thinking about the dress she wore, how different it felt from the torn brown wool she'd arrived in. That dress had been the garment of a victim, someone running from circumstances beyond her control. This dress was the choice of a woman who had found her place in the world and intended to defend it. "There's something else," Samuel said as they watched the judge's carriage disappear down the mountain road. "Something we need to discuss." Beth looked at him, noting the serious set of his jaw. "What?" "We can't live our lives waiting for Blackwood to make his next move. We have to decide what kind of life we're going to build together, regardless of what threats might be lurking in the future." It was a profound observation, and one that struck at the heart of their situation. They had married for protection, but protection couldn't be the foundation of a real marriage. At some point, they had to choose whether they were simply two people hiding together or a couple building something meaningful. "What kind of life do you want to build?" Beth asked. Samuel was quiet for a moment, looking out at the vast expanse of mountain landscape that surrounded them. "I want to build something that matters. Not just survival, but something that would make Margaret proud and give you the freedom you've never had." "What would that look like?" "A real homestead, cattle, maybe some sheep, crops that could feed other families, not just ourselves. A place where people in trouble could find help, the way you found help here." Beth felt something warm spread through her chest at his words. "A sanctuary, for people who need one. You're not the only woman who's ever run from a situation like Blackwood's. There are others out there who could use a place to start over." The vision he painted was beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. To openly provide sanctuary for other women fleeing violent men would make them a target for every Blackwood in the territory. But it would also make their marriage, their life together, something larger than just personal happiness. "It would be risky," Beth said. "Everything worthwhile is risky." Beth looked down at her new dress, thinking about all the women who had worn similar garments to similar effect, women who had chosen dignity over safety, principle over convenience, women who had decided that some things were worth fighting for. "Then yes," she said firmly, "let's build something that matters." As they walked back toward their cabin, Beth felt the weight of her new dress, her new name and her new purpose settling around her like armor. Whatever Blackwood might do, whatever threats the future might hold, she and Samuel would face them together as partners in something larger than just survival. They would face them as people who had chosen to matter. 6 months after their hastily spoken vows, Samuel Reed stood in the doorway of their expanded cabin, watching his wife tend to the vegetable garden that now flourished where once only wild grass had grown. The morning sun caught the simple wooden wedding band on his finger, carved from mountain pine and worn smooth by daily work, and he marveled at how completely his life had transformed. Beth knelt among the rows of beans and squash, her movements efficient and purposeful as she checked each plant for signs of growth or disease. She wore a practical work dress of sturdy brown cotton, her hair pinned back in a style that spoke of a woman too busy building a life to worry about fashion. But there was something in her posture, in the confident way she moved through their shared space, that spoke of deep contentment. The wooden wedding bands they now wore had replaced the gold rings of Samuel's first marriage in a quiet ceremony performed just for themselves one evening in late spring. It had been Beth's suggestion, born from her understanding that honoring the past didn't require living in its shadow. The pine rings represented their choice to build something new together, rooted in the land they worked and the life they were creating. The Hendersons sent word. Beth called out, not looking up from her work. Judge Whitman's letter arrived. Blackwood's been convicted. Samuel felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't fully realized he'd been carrying. What charges? Murder in the second degree for both wives. He'll spend the rest of his life in territorial prison. Beth sat back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. It's over, Samuel. Really over this time. The news should have brought pure relief, but Samuel found his emotions more complicated than that. Justice for Blackwood's victims was important, but it couldn't restore the years of fear those women had endured or bring them back to the lives they should have lived. It could only ensure that no other women would suffer the same fate. There's more news, Beth continued, rising and walking toward him with something that looked suspiciously like excitement in her eyes. Mary Henderson stopped by while you were checking the traps. She's been talking to women in town, and it seems word of what we're building here has spread. Samuel raised an eyebrow. Their decision to turn their homestead into an unofficial sanctuary for women fleeing dangerous situations had been quietly successful. Over the past few months, they'd provided temporary shelter and assistance to 3 different women, helping them reach safety and start new lives. But they'd tried to keep the operation discreet, understanding that too much attention could bring unwanted scrutiny. What kind of word? The good kind. Dr. Morrison, the one who testified against Blackwood, wants to establish a formal arrangement. He's willing to provide medical care for any women we help, no questions asked. And the new territorial marshal has indicated he'd support our efforts unofficially. Samuel absorbed this information, recognizing both the opportunity and the responsibility it represented. What had started as a desperate measure to protect one woman was evolving into something that could help many. And you want to expand what we're doing? I want to make it official. Register with the territorial government as a sanctuary station. Accept the support that's being offered. Beth moved to stand beside him in the doorway, her shoulder brushing his arm in the casual intimacy that had developed between them over months of shared work and quiet evenings. I want to help other women find what I found here. What did you find here? Beth looked up at him with eyes that held depths of understanding earned through experience. Choice, the chance to determine my own life instead of having it determined for me. Safety that doesn't require me to diminish myself to earn it. Samuel considered her words, thinking about the woman who had arrived at his door 6 months ago, desperate, frightened, reduced to begging for a single night's shelter. That woman bore little resemblance to the confident partner who now stood beside him, planning ways to extend their sanctuary to others in need. "What about us?" he asked. "Our life together? This would mean less privacy, more responsibility, constant awareness that we're being watched by both supporters and critics." "This is our life together," Beth replied simply. "Taking care of each other, building something that matters, using what we've learned to help others. I can't imagine anything more meaningful than that." Samuel looked out at the homestead they'd built together, the expanded cabin with its additional sleeping quarters, the flourishing garden that produced enough food to feed multiple families, the well-maintained outbuildings that could shelter travelers and their animals. Everything they'd created had been designed with hospitality in mind, as if they'd always known their sanctuary would grow beyond just the two of them. "There's something else," Beth said softly. "Something I've been meaning to tell you." Samuel turned to face her fully, noting the particular quality of her smile that had learned to recognize over their months together. "Dr. Morrison confirmed it when he was here last week. We're going to have a baby." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow, but a joyful one. After years of believing that part of his life was over, the prospect of fatherhood felt like an unexpected gift from a universe that had already given him more than he dared to hope for. "When?" he managed to ask. "Early spring, March, maybe April." Beth's hand moved to rest on her still flat stomach. "I know we hadn't planned this," but Samuel silenced her with a kiss that tasted of morning coffee and the promise of years to come. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, overwhelmed by the completeness of joy he hadn't felt since Margaret's death. "We'll need to expand the cabin again," he said practically, "and hire more help for the sanctuary work, and build a proper school for the children who'll be born here, and establish better relationships with the surrounding communities." They stood together in their doorway, planning a future that stretched far beyond their individual needs to encompass the family they were creating and the families they hoped to help. The sun climbed higher over the Wyoming mountains, painting their small valley in shades of gold and green that spoke of prosperity and peace. That evening, as they sat by their fire sharing a simple meal and planning for the expansion of their sanctuary work, Samuel realized that happiness had crept up on him without his notice. Not the desperate passion of youth or the overwhelming joy of new love, but the steady contentment of two people who had found their purpose in caring for each other and extending that care to others in need. Outside, snow began to fall, the first snow of another Wyoming winter. But inside their cabin, warmth and light pushed back against the cold, and two people who had found each other by accident continued the intentional work of building something that would last. In the distance, Samuel could see the lights of the Henderson place, warm and welcoming in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new people in need of help, new opportunities to grow the sanctuary they were building together. But tonight, for this moment, Samuel Reed was no longer the loneliest man in Wyoming territory. He was a husband, a soon-to-be father, and a man who had learned that sometimes the most important question isn't whether you can stay the night, but whether you're willing to stay forever.